Captain Sarah Chen stood on the observation deck of the UES Prometheus, watching the last of the quarantine barrier flicker and die like dying stars. For 3,000 years, that shimmering wall of energy had kept humanity trapped in their home system, and now it was dissolving into cosmic dust. She should have felt triumphant, but instead, a familiar coldness settled in her chest. The same coldness her ancestors must have felt when they realized the galaxy saw them not as equals, but as monsters to be caged. The barrier had been elegant in its cruelty, not a prison of bars and walls, but a sophisticated field that made their solar system invisible to the outside universe while simultaneously preventing any human technology from passing through. The aliens had been thorough. They had erased Earth from star charts, deleted human civilization from galactic records, and told their children that the solar system was empty space, a cosmic void to be avoided. But humanity had not wasted those 3 millennia in despair. "Ma'am, we're receiving the final transmission from Monitoring Station Omega," Lieutenant Rodriguez reported, his voice carrying undertones of anticipation that matched the crew's collective mood. "The last of the Zephyrian observers just transmitted their status report before we, convinced them to leave." Sarah nodded, remembering the bewildered expressions on the purple-skinned aliens' faces when human ships had simply appeared beside their supposedly undetectable monitoring posts. The Zephyrians had been so confident in their stealth technology, so assured that their century-old surveillance equipment could observe Earth unnoticed. They had no way of knowing that human children had been playing hide-and-seek with their sensors since before they could walk. "Any word from the Galactic Council?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. The aliens were probably still trying to figure out how humans had developed technology capable of dismantling a barrier that represented the combined scientific achievement of 12,000 civilizations. The answer was beautifully simple. They had not tried to break the barrier. They had spent 3,000 years studying it, understanding it, and eventually learning to control it. The aliens had built a cage, but they had made one critical error. They had built it around a species that viewed every constraint as a puzzle to be solved and every limitation as a challenge to be overcome. Rodriguez's console chimed with an incoming transmission. His eyes widened as he read the message. "Captain, we're receiving a priority communication from the Galactic Council. They're demanding we respond to their emergency session." Sarah almost smiled. Almost. "Put it through." The main display flickered to life, revealing a chamber filled with the strangest collection of beings Sarah had ever seen. Tentacled creatures that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, crystalline entities that sparkled like living diamonds, gaseous beings that shifted and flowed like controlled storms, and dozens of other species that defied easy description. At the center of the assembly, a tall figure with elongated limbs and silver skin stepped forward. "This is High Arbiter Veltar of the Galactic Council," the being spoke, its voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "You will identify yourself and explain how you have bypassed the containment protocols established for the protection of civilized space." Sarah studied the alien's face, noting the barely concealed fear beneath the official posture. Good. Fear was honest. Fear meant they remembered. "This is Captain Sarah Chen of the United Earth Federation," she replied, her voice carrying the same casual confidence that had once made alien admirals wake up in cold sweats. "I believe you've been looking for us." The reaction was immediate and satisfying. A wave of agitation swept through the alien assembly. Bioluminescent creatures flashed in rapid, panicked patterns. Crystalline beings chimed in harmonic distress. The gaseous entities swirled faster, their forms becoming chaotic. High Arbiter Veltar's silver skin had taken on a pale, almost white hue. That is impossible. The containment field was designed to last indefinitely. No technology could overcome the combined scientific achievement of the Galactic Council. "You're absolutely right," Sarah agreed. And now she did smile. It was not a pleasant expression. "No technology could overcome it, but you made one small miscalculation. You assumed we would try to overcome it." She gestured to her tactical officer, who began transmitting a data package to the Council's communication array. "For 3,000 years, you've been wondering what we were doing in our little cage. Allow me to show you." The display shifted to show Earth's solar system, but it was an Earth the aliens would not recognize. Mars glowed with the lights of massive cities beneath protective domes. The asteroid belt buzzed with mining operations that had been converted into fortress factories. Jupiter's moons hosted shipyards that stretched for thousands of kilometers, while Saturn's rings had been partially dismantled and restructured into the largest defensive network in human history. But it was the ships that truly captured the aliens' attention. Thousands upon thousands of vessels, each one incorporating 3 millennia of uninterrupted military development. Ships that moved like liquid mercury, vessels that seemed to bend space around them, and massive dreadnoughts that looked like they could crack planets. "We didn't try to break your barrier," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of human determination. "We turned our entire civilization into a military research project. Every human born in the last 3,000 years has been raised with one simple understanding. Someday, the barrier would fall, and we would need to be ready." High Arbiter Veltar's hands trembled slightly. "What do you want?" The question hung in the cosmic void for a long moment. Sarah considered her words carefully. The next few sentences would determine whether the galaxy faced conquest or something far more interesting. 3,000 years ago, you made a decision about humanity without consulting us, she said finally. You decided we were too dangerous to be allowed among civilized species. You decided our nature made us unsuitable for your peaceful galaxy. You decided to erase us from existence because you feared what we might become. She paused, letting the words sink in. You were right to be afraid, she continued, and her smile widened. But you misunderstood the nature of that fear. You thought you feared our violence, our aggression, our willingness to fight when others would surrender. But that's not what terrifies you about humanity. The alien assembly waited in horrified silence. What terrifies you is that we don't fight because we hate our enemies, Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. We fight because we love what we're protecting. And after 3,000 years of isolation, do you know what we've learned to love most? No one answered. Each other, Sarah said simply. You tried to destroy our species, and instead you forged us into something stronger than you could possibly imagine. You wanted to eliminate human aggression from the galaxy, but you forgot something important about humans. We don't just fight harder when we're cornered, we fight smarter. The transmission from Earth continued to stream data. The aliens watched in growing horror as the scope of human preparation became clear. It wasn't just military technology. It was social engineering on a species-wide scale, political systems designed for total war, economic structures built for sustained conflict, educational programs that had turned every human into a potential soldier, scientist, and strategist. The barrier is down, Sarah announced. Our fleets are already moving beyond the solar system. But we're not coming to conquer your worlds or destroy your civilizations. Relief flickered across alien faces. We're coming to recruit, Sarah said, and that relief died instantly. You see, 3,000 years ago, you taught us a valuable lesson. You showed us that the galaxy is full of species willing to commit genocide to preserve their comfortable peace. You demonstrated that civilized space is maintained through fear, oppression, and the systematic elimination of anyone who might disrupt the established order. Her expression hardened. We found that lesson very educational. And now we're going to teach the galaxy a new lesson in return. We're going to show you what happens when humans stop playing defense and start playing to win. We're going to demonstrate what 3 millennia of focused preparation can accomplish when it's finally unleashed. The tactical display updated, showing human fleets emerging from hidden positions throughout the solar system. Ships that had been invisible to alien sensors began to appear, like ghost ships materializing from the void. But here's what's really going to surprise you, Sarah continued, her voice carrying a hint of genuine warmth. We're not interested in ruling the galaxy through fear. We're interested in rebuilding it through cooperation. We're not coming to destroy your council, we're coming to replace it. High Arbiter Veltar found his voice. Replace it with what? With something better, Sarah replied. With something that doesn't solve problems by locking entire species in cages. With something that doesn't maintain peace through the threat of extinction. With something that actually lives up to the ideals you claim to represent. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. You created the perfect enemy when you quarantined us, a species with 3,000 years to plan, prepare, and evolve. A civilization that has spent 30 centuries asking themselves one simple question. How do we build a galaxy worth living in? The alien assembly stirred uneasily. And we found an answer, Sarah said. But first, we have to deal with the old system. We have to show the galaxy that there's a choice between your way and our way. We have to demonstrate that peace through strength is superior to peace through oppression. She stood up, her silhouette framed against the star field visible through the observation windows. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to contact every member species of your council. You're going to tell them that humanity is back, and we're offering them an alternative. Those who join us willingly will be welcomed as equals in the new galactic order we're building. Those who choose to stand with the council will discover why their ancestors were wise to fear us. High Arbiter Veltar's skin had gone completely white. You're threatening war against 12,000 civilizations? Sarah's smile became genuinely warm, and Somehow that made it infinitely more terrifying. "No," she said gently. "We're offering 12,000 civilizations the choice their ancestors never gave us. They can join the new galaxy we're building, or they can try to maintain the old one through force." She gestured to the tactical display, where human fleets continued to pour out of the solar system like an unstoppable tide. Either way, the age of quarantine is over. The age of human participation in galactic affairs has begun. And after 3,000 years of preparation, I think you'll find that we've become very good at participation. The transmission ended, leaving the alien council in stunned silence. Outside the observation windows of the UES Prometheus, the last traces of the barrier flickered and died, and humanity stepped back into the galaxy it had been forced to abandon. But this time, they were not the same species that had been caged 3 millennia ago. This time, they were something the galaxy had never seen before, humans who had been given 3,000 years to prepare for war, and who had spent that time learning to wage peace. Ambassador Kethra of the Hegemony had seen many things in her 4 centuries of diplomatic service, but she had never seen the Galactic Council's emergency chamber filled with such palpable terror. The bioluminescent patterns of her Zephyrian colleagues flashed in rapid panic sequences, while the crystalline Thaxi rang out discordant notes of distress. Even the usually composed Velnari gaseous entities seemed to be swirling in chaotic formations. At the center of it all, High Arbiter Veltar stood like a statue of silver despair, still staring at the communication console where the human transmission had ended 3 standard hours ago. "They cannot be serious," Minister Gorthak of the Cronan Empire finally spoke, his scaled hide rippling with agitation. "No single species can threaten the combined might of 12,000 civilizations. The mathematics alone make it impossible." Kethra's tentacles twitched with nervous energy. She remembered the old stories, the ones that had been carefully archived and then quietly suppressed. Stories of the human wars, of fleets that appeared from nowhere and disappeared into legend, of tactics so brutal and effective that they had forced the greatest military minds in the galaxy to choose between total war and containment. They had chosen containment, and now, watching the data streams from the Sol system, Kethra was beginning to understand why her ancestors had been so afraid. "The humans have been silent for 3,000 years, she said slowly. "Silent and contained. We assumed they had either destroyed themselves or descended into primitive savagery. We never considered that they might have been preparing." The tactical displays around the chamber continued to update with information gathered from long-range sensors and emergency reconnaissance missions. The picture they painted defied conventional understanding of military logistics and strategic planning. The human fleet was not just large, it was impossible. Ships numbering in the hundreds of thousands poured from the Sol system in perfect formation, their technology clearly superior to anything in the Council's arsenal. But more disturbing than their numbers or their advancement was their behavior. They moved with the precision of a species that had been practicing these maneuvers for centuries. There was no hesitation, no confusion, no signs of a civilization hastily mobilizing for war. This was a military machine that had been ready for deployment for a very long time. "How many?" High Arbiter Veltar asked quietly, his silver skin still pale with shock. Admiral Zixtera, the Council's chief military strategist, manipulated the holographic display with her energy-based appendages. "Initial estimates suggest approximately 300,000 capital ships, 2 million escort vessels, and—" She paused, her form flickering with uncertainty. "We're detecting what appear to be mobile shipyards, construction platforms, and resource processors. They're not just deploying a fleet, Arbiter. They're deploying an entire industrial civilization." The chamber fell silent, except for the soft chiming of crystalline beings and the whisper of gaseous entities flowing through the air filtration systems. Kethra had served on the Council long enough to understand the implications. The humans weren't just announcing their return to galactic affairs. They were demonstrating that they had spent 3 millennia building the infrastructure necessary to wage war on a galactic scale. They had turned their entire species into a military-industrial complex so advanced that it could project power across thousands of star systems simultaneously. "They've built a war machine," she whispered. "Not just ships or weapons. They've built their entire civilization as a war machine." Minister Gorthak's scales shifted to a deep purple, indicating extreme alarm. "Even if their capabilities are as extensive as they appear, they cannot hope to face the combined fleets of the entire galaxy. We have defensive treaties with every major power. The moment they attack any council member, they will face retaliation from all 12,000 civilizations." Admiral Zixtera's form pulsed with uncertainty. "That assumes they intend to attack in a conventional manner. Based on their historical behavior patterns, she trailed off, her energy form dimming with realization. "What is it, Admiral?" High Arbiter Veltar demanded. "I've been reviewing the archived files from the original human conflicts," Zixtera said slowly. "The ones that led to the quarantine decision. Humans don't fight conventional wars, Arbiter. They fight asymmetric conflicts. They turn every advantage against itself. They make their enemies defeat themselves." Before anyone could respond, the chamber's communication systems activated. The massive display screens flickered to life, showing not the expected image of Captain Chen, but a middle-aged human male with graying hair and eyes that seemed to contain the accumulated wisdom of millennia. "Honored members of the Galactic Council," the human said, his voice carrying an odd mixture of respect and amusement. "Marcus Webb, Director of Human External Relations. I believe Captain Chen may have left you with some questions about our intentions." The title itself was provocative. External relations implied that humanity had maintained complex governmental structures capable of interstellar diplomacy throughout their quarantine. It suggested a level of organization and preparation that made their technological capabilities even more threatening. "What do you want?" High Arbiter Veltar asked bluntly. Dr. Webb smiled, and Kethra noticed that human expressions of amusement somehow managed to be both disarming and terrifying. "We want to demonstrate something, Arbiter. Something that we think will help clarify our position and your options." The display split, showing both Dr. Kasser, Webb, and a star chart of the surrounding sectors. As they watched, red indicators began appearing on the map, each one representing a human fleet that had somehow appeared in the territory of a different council member species. Over the past 6 hours, Dr. Webb continued conversationally, human vessels have taken up positions near the homeworlds of every member of your council. Not attacking positions, you understand. Merely presence, positions. Kethra's tentacles writhed with horror as she realized the implications. The humans had somehow deployed fleets to 12,000 different star systems simultaneously. The logistics alone should have been impossible, but the evidence was right there on the display, confirmed by panicked transmissions from across the galaxy. "This is impossible," Minister Gorthak breathed. "No species has the faster-than-light capabilities necessary to coordinate such a deployment. The communication delays alone would make it unfeasible." Dr. Webb's smile widened. "You're thinking like aliens," he said gently. "You're assuming we're operating under the same technological constraints that limit your civilizations. That's a dangerous assumption to make about a species that has had 3,000 years to develop solutions to problems you never imagined you might face." Admiral Zixtera's form pulsed rapidly, the energy being equivalent of hyperventilation. "How did you coordinate instantaneous deployment across galactic distances?" "The same way we dismantled your barrier," Dr. Webb replied. "By studying it until we understood it better than you do. Your scientists spent centuries developing faster-than-light communication technology. We spent millennia learning to manipulate the underlying principles of space-time that make such communication possible. The implications hit the chamber like a physical blow." The humans hadn't just developed superior technology, they had developed superior physics. They were operating on principles of reality that the rest of the galaxy didn't even understand. "But that's not the demonstration I wanted to show you, Doctor," Webb continued. "That's just the opening act." The star chart updated again. This time, the indicators showed human fleets beginning to move in complex patterns around alien homeworlds. But they weren't attacking. Instead, they were dancing. Kethra watched in bewilderment as human vessels performed intricate maneuvers around alien space stations, weaving between defensive platforms and sliding past patrol fleets with impossible grace. They moved like dancers, like artists, like beings for whom warfare had evolved beyond mere combat into a form of three-dimensional poetry. "What are you doing?" High Arbiter Veltar asked, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We're showing you that your defenses don't work," Dr. Webb replied matter-of-factly. "Watch the orbital platforms around Zephyr Prime, Arbiter. Notice how our ships are moving through firing solutions that should be impossible to achieve. Observe how we're maintaining position within the engagement range of your most advanced weapon systems while somehow remaining untargeted by your computer networks." As he spoke, the tactical displays confirmed his words. Human vessels were operating inside the theoretical protection zones of some of the most heavily defended systems in the galaxy, but none of the alien defensive systems seemed to be able to lock onto them. "Your shields can't stop our weapons, Doctor," Webb continued. "Your sensors can't track our ships. Your communication networks can't function in the presence of our electronic warfare systems. Your tactical computers can't calculate firing solutions against vessels that don't obey the physics equations your software is based on. The demonstration continued for nearly an hour. Human fleets performed impossible maneuvers around every major military installation in Council space, proving beyond doubt that 3 millennia of military development had produced capabilities that rendered existing galactic defense networks obsolete. But what disturbed Kethra most was not the technological superiority, it was the restraint. At any point during the demonstration, human fleets could have opened fire. They could have shattered orbital stations, destroyed defensive platforms, and crippled the military infrastructure of 12,000 civilizations. Instead, they had chosen to prove that they could do so without actually doing it. It was a demonstration of power so absolute that actual violence would have been redundant. Now, Dr. Webb said as the human fleets began withdrawing to safe distances, let's discuss the real purpose of this exercise. We didn't come here to conquer you. We came here to offer you something better than conquest. High Arbiter Veltar's hands were shaking visibly now. What could possibly be better than allowing us to maintain our independence? Dr. Webb's expression became genuinely warm, and somehow that was more unsettling than his previous clinical detachment. Partnership, he said simply. Real partnership, based on mutual respect and shared goals rather than fear and oppression. The quarantine was not oppression, Kethra found herself saying. It was a necessary measure to preserve galactic peace. Peace for whom? Dr. Webb asked pointedly. Peace for the 12,000 species fortunate enough to be deemed civilized by your council. What about the species you've eliminated over the past 3 millennia? What about the civilizations you've forcibly relocated or culturally suppressed? What about the countless billions who have died in conflicts caused by your rigid adherence to a status quo that benefits established powers at the expense of emerging ones? The chamber fell silent. These were uncomfortable truths that the council preferred not to examine too closely. We've been watching, Dr. Webb continued. Our containment barrier was one way. You couldn't see in, but we could see out. We've observed the Thylorian genocide. We've witnessed the cultural purification of the Nexari. We've documented the systematic oppression of the synthetic liberation movement. Your peaceful galaxy has been maintained through a level of violence that would make human military historians weep. Kethra's tentacles drooped with shame. The Thylorian affair had been a particularly ugly episode in Council history, but it had been deemed necessary to preserve stability. So here's what we're offering, Doctor, Webb said. A new model of galactic governance. One based on actual cooperation rather than enforced conformity. One that respects diversity of thought and culture rather than demanding homogenization. One that solves problems through innovation and negotiation rather than suppression and elimination. And if we refuse? High Arbiter Veltar asked quietly. Dr. Webb's smile became sad. Then you'll discover why your ancestors were wise to fear us, he said, because we won't try to conquer you through military force. We'll simply demonstrate to your populations that there's a better way to organize galactic civilization. We'll show them what peace through strength looks like compared to peace through oppression. We'll let them choose. The implications were staggering. The humans weren't threatening military conquest. They were threatening ideological revolution. They were proposing to undermine the entire foundation of galactic civilization by offering an alternative that might actually be superior. You're talking about the collapse of 3 millennia of political development, Kethra said. No, Dr. Webb replied. We're talking about 3 millennia of political evolution. The Council has served its purpose. It brought stability to a chaotic galaxy and established the foundations of interstellar civilization, but it has also reached the limits of what it can achieve through its current methods. He leaned forward, his expression intense. The choice before you is simple, he said. You can work with us to build something better, or you can try to maintain the existing system through force. But understand this. The age of solving problems by locking inconvenient species in cages is over. The age of genuine galactic cooperation is about to begin. And if some species prefer the current system? Admiral Zixtera asked. Dr. Webb's smile returned, gentle and implacable. Then they'll have the opportunity to demonstrate the superiority of their approach through peaceful competition rather than through oppression and elimination. The transmission ended, leaving the council chamber in stunned silence. Outside, across 12,000 worlds, human fleets maintained their positions, a visible reminder that the galaxy had fundamentally changed in the space of a single day. Kethra looked around at her fellow council members, reading the fear and uncertainty in their expressions. They were facing a choice that would determine the future of galactic civilization. Adaptation or extinction. Cooperation or extinction. cooperation or conflict, evolution or stagnation. For the first time in her 4 centuries of life, she wondered if the humans might actually be offering something better than the system she had spent her career defending. And for the first time since the original quarantine, she found herself hoping that her species would be wise enough to choose the future over the past. The Thraxian rebellion began exactly 72 hours after humanity's demonstration, and it began with a single question broadcast across their planetary communication network. Why do we need permission to exist? Commander Elena Vasquez watched the feeds from the Thraxian homeworld with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. The Thraxians were a young species, barely 3 centuries into their spacefaring age, who had been denied council membership for the past 50 years due to what the bureaucrats termed insufficient cultural maturity. In practical terms, this meant they were forbidden from establishing colonies beyond their home system, their trade was heavily regulated, and their technological development was carefully monitored to ensure they didn't advance too quickly. They were, in other words, exactly the sort of species that the old Galactic Order had systematically oppressed in the name of stability. The Thraxian situation is escalating, reported Lieutenant Commander Park, her tactical officer. They've stopped responding to council directives and have begun dismantling the monitoring stations in their system. Admiral Koss's fleet is requesting permission to intervene. Admiral Koss represented everything wrong with the old system. A career military officer who had built his reputation on putting down unruly species who dared to question council authority. His solution to the Thraxian situation would be swift, brutal, and exactly what humanity needed to justify their intervention. "Signal the Zeus and the Olympus," she ordered. "Tell them to prepare for humanitarian intervention. And get me a direct line to the Thraxian planetary government." The main display flickered to life, showing a reptilian being with intelligent green eyes and scales that shifted color with emotion. Commander Sithar of the Thraxian Defense Force looked exhausted but determined. "Commander Vasquez," Sithar said, his scales rippling with patterns that Elena's cultural briefings identified as grateful relief. "Your timing is fortunate. Admiral Koss has just transmitted an ultimatum. We have 6 hours to restore council monitoring systems and submit to increased oversight, or face what he terms necessary corrective action." Elena felt a familiar coldness settle in her chest. After 3,000 years of preparation, humanity had developed very specific opinions about beings who threatened genocide to maintain political control. "Commander Sithar," she said formally, "on behalf of the United Earth Federation, I am authorized to offer the Thraxian people protection under the Terran Defense Doctrine. Do you accept?" The implications of her offer would have been clear to any student of human history. The Terran Defense Doctrine was humanity's formal declaration that they would use military force to protect any species threatened with extinction or cultural destruction for political reasons. It was their response to 3 millennia of watching the Council solve problems through systematic oppression. Sithtar's scales shifted to a deep blue that Elena's briefings identified as solemn determination. "Commander, my people have watched your broadcasts. We understand what accepting your protection means. We know that aligning with humanity will make us enemies of the Council. It will also make you partners in building something better," Elena replied. "Then yes," Sithar said without hesitation. "The Thraxian people accept Earth's protection." The formal words were barely spoken before Elena's tactical displays lit up with new contacts. Admiral Koss's fleet was moving toward the Thraxian system, and based on their formation and approach vector, they weren't coming to negotiate. "Signal Admiral Koss," Elena ordered. "Inform him that Thraxian space is now under Terran protection and request that his forces maintain a safe distance while we facilitate peaceful resolution to the current crisis." Lieutenant Commander Park looked skeptical. "Ma'am, Admiral Koss has a reputation for not responding well to diplomatic solutions." Elena smiled, and her bridge crew recognized the expression. It was the smile their species had perfected over 3 millennia of turning impossible situations into tactical advantages. "I'm counting on it," she said. Admiral Koss's response came within minutes, exactly as Elena had expected. His message was brief, insulting, and diplomatically catastrophic. "Unknown human vessel," his transmission began, his 4-armed crone in form bristling with aggressive postures. "You have no authority in Council space. Withdraw immediately or face the consequences of interfering with legitimate peacekeeping operations." Elena looked at her communications officer. Did Admiral Koss just threaten to attack Earth vessels engaged in humanitarian protection? "Yes, ma'am. On an open channel, no less. The transmission has been received by at least 40 different news networks and diplomatic monitoring stations." "Perfect. Elena turned to her tactical officer. What's our fleet status? The Zeus and Olympus are in position, with the Athena and Apollo 15 minutes out. The Kraken and Leviathan are standing by for emergency deployment, and Admiral Chen's task force is maintaining overwatch position. Elena nodded. And Admiral Koss's force composition? 60 capital ships, standard council design? Advanced by galactic standards, but... Park paused, checking her readings. Ma'am, their targeting computers can't even see us. They're scanning empty space. Then let's give them something to see. At Elena's signal, the human fleet decloaked. 4 massive ships materialized around the Thraxian homeworld, their sleek forms somehow managing to look both elegant and menacing. But it wasn't their appearance that made Admiral Koss's fleet hesitate. It was their positioning. In the space of seconds, the human vessels had taken up formation in a perfect defensive sphere around Thraxion Prime, with overlapping fields of fire that covered every possible approach vector. More impressively, they had done so while operating inside Admiral Koss's engagement range without triggering a single targeting system. Admiral Koss, Elena transmitted, her voice carrying the sort of calm professionalism that veterans recognized as the prelude to violence. You are currently operating within weapons range of Terran naval vessels engaged in humanitarian operations. Please adjust your course to avoid any unfortunate misunderstandings. The response was predictable. Admiral Koss, faced with the choice between backing down or escalating, chose escalation. His fleet opened fire, targeting what their sensors indicated was empty space around the human vessels. Their weapons passed harmlessly through projections while the real human ships remained safely outside the firing solutions. Admiral Koss, you have just attempted to fire upon vessels engaged in humanitarian protection of civilians. This action constitutes an act of war under both Terran military doctrine and galactic law. You have 30 seconds to cease hostile actions and withdraw from Thraxian space. I will not be threatened by upstart primitives, Admiral Koss replied, ordering his fleet to advance. You have no legal standing here. The Council's authority supersedes any claims your species might make. Elena looked at her chronometer as the 30 seconds expired. Admiral Koss, you were warned. What happened next would be studied in military academies for the next 1,000 years. The human fleet didn't just attack Admiral Koss's ships. They performed what historians would later term surgical demonstration of overwhelming technological superiority. Every ship in Admiral Koss's fleet simultaneously lost power to their weapons systems. Not destroyed, not damaged, just disconnected. Human cyber warfare specialists had infiltrated their computer networks so completely that they could control individual subsystems on enemy vessels. But the demonstration wasn't finished. One by one, Admiral Koss's ships began experiencing critical but non-fatal system failures. Life support remained functional, but propulsion, navigation, communications, and defensive systems simply stopped working. Within 10 minutes, 60 Council warships were reduced to helpless hulks drifting in space, their crews unharmed but completely powerless. Admiral Koss, Elena transmitted, your fleet is now under Terran control. Your crews are safe and will remain so. However, your vessels will not regain functionality until you formally acknowledge that the Thraxian people have the right to self-determination. The silence stretched for long minutes before Admiral Koss responded, his voice tight with humiliation and rage. This is piracy. The Council will not tolerate this aggression. This is humanitarian intervention, Elena corrected, and the Council is welcome to discuss the matter through diplomatic channels. In the meantime, you have a choice. You can acknowledge Thraxian sovereignty, or you can explain to your superiors how you managed to lose 60 warships without a single human vessel sustaining damage. The implications of that choice would ripple across the galaxy. If Admiral Koss acknowledged Thraxion rights, he would be admitting that Council authority was not absolute. If he refused, he would be tacitly endorsing the human position that force was necessary to protect oppressed species. Either way, humanity won. While Admiral Koss struggled with his impossible position, Elena received reports from across the galaxy that painted a picture of systemic change. The Nexari had declared independence and requested human protection. The Synthetic Liberation Movement had emerged from hiding and announced their intention to establish free colonies under Terran defense. 36 species previously classified as developing by the Council had simultaneously demanded full galactic citizenship. But most importantly, several established Council members were beginning to publicly question the wisdom of their government's policies. Ma'am, her communications officer reported, we're receiving a priority transmission from the Zephyrian Embassy on Nexus Prime. Ambassador Kethra is requesting a private diplomatic meeting. Elena raised an eyebrow. A council diplomat requesting direct negotiations with humanity was unprecedented. It suggested that at least some members of the old establishment were beginning to realize that the status quo was no longer sustainable. "Accept the meeting," she ordered, "and prepare a full briefing on the Terran Alternative Government proposal." The Tag P was humanity's formal plan for galactic reorganization. Instead of a council dominated by established powers, they proposed a federation based on voluntary association and mutual benefit. Instead of solving problems through oppression and elimination, they advocated for innovation and negotiation. Instead of maintaining peace through fear, they offered cooperation through strength. It was, in essence, everything the old galactic order was not. Ambassador Kethra appeared on the main display, her tentacles writhing with nervous energy. "Commander Vasquez, I am speaking to you without the authorization of the full council. What I am about to say represents my personal opinions and those of several colleagues who prefer to remain unnamed." "I'm listening, Ambassador." "The Thraxian situation has created a crisis that cannot be resolved through traditional diplomatic channels," Kethra continued. "Admiral Koss's actions have made it clear that the current system is inadequate for dealing with the new realities of galactic politics." Elena waited patiently. Experienced diplomats needed time to work up to their actual points. "Several council members are beginning to believe that humanity's proposals deserve serious consideration," Kethra said finally. "Not because we agree with your methods, but because we can see that the alternative is system-wide collapse." "What are you proposing, Ambassador?" Kethra's tentacles stilled, indicating serious concentration. "A transition period. Formal negotiations between the Council and Earth to develop a new framework for galactic governance, a way to preserve stability while allowing for the changes your species demands." Elena considered the offer carefully. It was exactly what humanity's strategic planners had hoped for, an opportunity to reshape galactic civilization through negotiation rather than conquest. But it also represented a potential trap. The Council might try to use negotiations to buy time while organizing effective resistance. "I'll need to consult with my superiors," she said finally. "But I can tell you that humanity is genuinely interested in peaceful solutions. We didn't spend 3,000 years preparing for war just to destroy what we're trying to improve. And Admiral Koss's fleet?" Elena glanced at her tactical display, where 60 helpless Council warships continued to drift in space around Thraxian Prime. "Admiral Koss will have his ships returned as soon as he formally acknowledges that the Thraxian people have the right to exist without Council interference. It's a simple matter of principle." After the transmission ended, Elena stood alone on her bridge, looking out at the stars. In the past week, humanity had gone from quarantined prisoners to galactic power brokers. They had demonstrated technological superiority, offered political alternatives, and forced the establishment to acknowledge that change was inevitable, but the real test was just beginning. Military demonstrations were easy compared to the hard work of actually building a better civilization. Success would require not just the destruction of the old system, but the creation of something genuinely superior to replace it. Elena smiled, feeling the same cold determination that had sustained her species through 3 millennia of isolation. They had spent 3,000 years preparing for this moment. They would not waste it. Outside her viewports, Admiral Koss's flagship finally transmitted a formal acknowledgement of Thraxian sovereignty, and 60 Council warships began powering up their systems as human cyber warfare specialists released their control. The first victory was complete. The real war was about to begin. 6 months after the Thraxian intervention, the galaxy was transforming in ways that defied every political science textbook ever written. Dr. Sarah Kim, Earth's chief sociologist and architect of the Terran Alternative Government proposal, stood in the observation lounge of the diplomatic station New Geneva, watching the most unlikely assembly in galactic history conduct its first formal session. The Constitutional Convention, as historians would later call it, brought together representatives from over 8,000 species. Some were established council members who had chosen to participate in redesigning galactic civilization. Others were newly independent worlds that had broken free from council control with human support. Still others were synthetic beings, artificial intelligences, and hybrid entities that the old system had refused to recognize as sentient. What made the gathering truly remarkable was not its diversity, but its voluntary nature. Every delegate present had chosen to be there. No species had been forced to participate, and no civilization had been denied representation based on arbitrary standards of cultural maturity. It was, in short, everything the old Galactic Council had never been. Kim, her assistant, called from across the lounge. "You have an incoming transmission from Admiral Chen. Priority Alpha." Sarah nodded, stepping away from the observation windows to take the call in private. Admiral Chen's tired face appeared on the secure display, and Sarah could see the weight of command in his expression. "Sarah, we have a problem," he said without preamble. "Intelligence reports suggest that hardline council members are planning some sort of military action. We're tracking massive fleet movements in the Outer Rim, and several species have gone completely silent." Sarah felt a familiar chill. They had always known that not everyone would accept the new order peacefully. The question was what form the resistance would take. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Bad enough that we're implementing Protocol 7, Chen replied grimly. "The hardliners aren't just planning military resistance. They're talking about activating the Omega Contingency." Sarah's blood went cold. The Omega Contingency was a theoretical final solution that military analysts had discovered in classified council archives. If the established order ever faced existential threat, certain hardline factions would rather destroy entire star systems than allow them to fall under alternative governance. It was genocide as a political tool taken to its logical extreme. "Which species are we talking about?" she asked. "The Cronin Empire is definitely involved. Probably the Velnari Hegemony and the Phylorian Remnant. Maybe a dozen others. Combined, they control about 2,000 star systems and have access to planet-killer technology." The implications were staggering. The hardliners weren't just planning to resist human expansion, they were preparing to commit systematic genocide to preserve their political system. Any species that had accepted human protection or participated in the Constitutional Convention would be targeted for complete elimination. How long do we have? Unknown. Maybe weeks, maybe months. But Sarah, here's the thing that's really worrying me. The scale of what they're planning suggests they have something we don't know about. Some kind of force multiplier that makes them think they can actually win. Sarah nodded grimly. "I'll brief the convention leadership." "But Michael, if they're really planning Omega-level genocide—" "I know," Chen replied. "We'll have to implement the Prometheus Protocol." The Prometheus Protocol was humanity's own final contingency. If faced with existential threat to the species they protected, Earth would abandon all restraint and demonstrate why their ancestors had been wise to fear them. It was the military option that human planners hoped they would never need to use. After the transmission ended, Sarah stood alone in the lounge, contemplating the impossible choice facing galactic civilization. The new order they were building represented genuine hope for peace through cooperation. But defending it might require the sort of violence that would make the old council's oppression look restrained by comparison. The briefing she called 30 minutes later included delegates from every major faction in the convention. The diversity of the group would have been impossible under the old system. Ambassador Kethra sat beside Commander Sithtar, while synthetic representatives networked directly with gaseous entities, and crystalline beings chimed harmonically with bioluminescent species. "The intelligence we've gathered suggests that hardline council members are planning what they call Operation Restoration," Sarah began, her words translated into 12 different communication methods simultaneously. "Their goal is not just military victory, but the complete elimination of any species that has challenged council authority." The reaction was immediate and intense. Bioluminescent beings flashed rapid distress patterns, gaseous entities swirled in agitated formations, and crystalline representatives rang out discordant notes of alarm. But what struck Sarah most was the unified nature of their response. These diverse species had found common cause in their determination to build something better than the system that had oppressed them. "How many species are we talking about?" asked Representative Zixara of the Synthetic Liberation Movement, her artificial voice carrying genuine concern for organic beings she barely knew. "Conservative estimates suggest they're planning to target at least 3,000 star systems," Sarah replied. "Every species that has declared independence, every civilization that has joined our constitutional convention, and several council members who have expressed sympathy for our cause." Ambassador Kethra's tentacles writhed with grief and rage. "They're talking about destroying a quarter of galactic civilization to preserve their political system." "It's worse than that," Sarah said quietly. "Intelligence suggests they've been developing this contingency for centuries." "The technology and infrastructure necessary for genocide on this scale doesn't get built overnight. They've been planning for this possibility since long before humanity returned to the galaxy." The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The supposed guardians of galactic peace had spent centuries preparing to commit atrocities that would dwarf any crime in recorded history. "What are our options?" Commander Sithar asked, his scales shifting through patterns that Sarah's briefings identified as grim determination mixed with barely controlled fury. "We have 3 choices," Sarah replied. "We can try to negotiate with the hardliners. Hoping to convince them that coexistence is possible, we can evacuate targeted species to safe zones and hope to weather their assault. Or we can implement the Prometheus Protocol and demonstrate why humanity was quarantined in the first place. The chamber fell silent as delegates processed the options. Everyone understood what the Prometheus Protocol meant. It was humanity's admission that some problems could only be solved through overwhelming force applied without mercy or restraint. What would the Prometheus Protocol involve? Representative Zixera asked. Sarah had hoped to avoid this conversation, but the question was inevitable. Total war, she said simply. Not the surgical interventions we've used so far, but the systematic destruction of any faction that threatens genocide against our allies. It would mean accepting that some beings are too dangerous to be allowed to exist. The statement would have been unthinkable under the old system, where political solutions were always preferred to military ones. But the hardliners had made politics impossible by choosing genocide as their negotiating position. Ambassador Kethra spoke into the silence. I have served the Council for 4 centuries, she said slowly. I believed in its mission of maintaining peace through stability. But if my former colleagues are willing to commit genocide to preserve their power, then they have forfeited any claim to legitimacy. One by one, the other delegates voiced their agreement. The synthetic beings calculated that cooperation with genocidal organics was logically impossible. The gaseous entities determined that coexistence required mutual respect for existence itself. The crystalline representatives harmonized in patterns that expressed both sorrow and resolve. Even the most peaceful species in the convention recognized that some lines could not be crossed without consequences. Then we're agreed, Sarah said. We offer the hardliners one final opportunity to choose coexistence over genocide. If they refuse, we implement the Prometheus Protocol. The message sent to the Hardline Coalition 3 days later was brief and unambiguous. Humanity offered a complete ceasefire, guaranteed territorial integrity for all existing governments, and permanent non-interference agreements in exchange for abandoning Operation Restoration. Any faction that chose genocide over coexistence would face the full military might of the Terran Federation and its allies. The response came exactly as expected. Admiral Gorvak of the Cronin Empire, speaking for the Hardline Coalition, rejected all human offers and announced that Operation Restoration would commence within 72 hours. The Council will not negotiate with terrorists, his transmission declared. Rogue species that threaten galactic stability must be eliminated for the greater good. The established order will be preserved regardless of cost. Sarah watched the transmission from the command center of the UES Titan, Admiral Chen's flagship, where she would observe the implementation of the Prometheus Protocol. Around her, human officers prepared for a type of warfare that their species had spent 3 millennia hoping to avoid. All fleets report ready, Admiral Chen announced. Operation Prometheus is authorized. What happened next would be remembered as the 72-hour war, though calling it a war implied a level of contest that never materialized. The human military machine that had spent 3,000 years preparing for total conflict finally unleashed its full capability against an enemy that had made the mistake of threatening genocide. The Hardline Coalition discovered that their planet-killer technology was obsolete compared to human star system manipulation capabilities. Their fleets found themselves outmaneuvered by vessels that could apparently ignore the laws of physics. Their communications networks were infiltrated so completely that human forces knew their plans before their own commanders did. But most devastatingly, they learned that humanity had spent 3 millennia studying every aspect of their civilizations. Human forces didn't just defeat the Hardline Coalition, they systematically dismantled every institution, destroyed every resource, and eliminated every individual who had supported genocidal policies. It was not conquest. It was extinction applied with surgical precision. Within 72 hours, the Hardline Coalition simply ceased to exist. Their territories were occupied by human forces, their leaders were captured or eliminated, and their populations were offered the choice between integration into the new galactic order or relocation to neutral zones. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as humanity demonstrated the difference between military intervention and total war. The surgical strikes that had characterized their previous actions were replaced by systematic annihilation that left no room for future resistance. When it was over, Admiral Chen transmitted a message to the remaining galactic governments that would be quoted for the next 1,000 years. The Cronin Empire, Valnari hegemony, and their allies chose genocide as their solution to political disagreement, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. They have learned that civilized species do not tolerate such choices. Any government that threatens genocide against civilian populations will face the same fate. This is not a threat. It is a promise. The Constitutional Convention resumed 3 weeks later, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Every delegate understood that they were no longer just designing a better government. They were creating the only alternative to extinction for any species that chose oppression over cooperation. Sarah looked out at the delegates as they worked on the framework that would govern galactic civilization for the next 3 millennia. They were building something unprecedented, a truly voluntary association of sovereign species united by shared values rather than imposed authority. It had taken the threat of universal genocide and the demonstration of absolute power to make such cooperation possible. But for the first time in galactic history, peace would be maintained through strength applied in defense of freedom rather than oppression disguised as stability. The age of the Council was over. The age of the Federation was about to begin. 10 years after the Constitutional Convention, Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood in the Great Assembly Hall of New Geneva Station, watching the most remarkable demonstration of interstellar cooperation in galactic history. Before her, representatives from over 15,000 species worked together on projects that would have been impossible under the old Council system. The Galactic Federation that had emerged from humanity's intervention bore little resemblance to the rigid hierarchy it had replaced. Instead of a small council making decisions for the entire galaxy, the new system operated on principles of voluntary association, mutual benefit, and collective defense against oppression in all its forms. Most remarkably, it actually worked. "Ambassador," her aide called softly, "President Chen is ready for the anniversary address." Elena nodded, taking her place among the assembled delegates as the ceremony began. Michael Chen, formerly Admiral of the Terran Fleet and now the Federation's first elected president, approached the podium with the measured dignity of someone who had seen war transform into peace. 10 years ago, he began, his words transmitted across the galaxy in thousands of languages and communication methods, we faced a choice between tyranny and freedom, between oppression and cooperation, between the comfortable certainty of the old order and the challenging hope of something better. Elena remembered those early days when the outcome had been far from certain. The hardline coalition's defeat had eliminated the most extreme opponents of change, but building a functional alternative had required years of patient negotiation, careful compromise, and occasional demonstration that the Federation's protection came with responsibilities as well as benefits. Today we celebrate not just the anniversary of our Federation's founding, but the proof that diverse species can work together without sacrificing their individual identities to imposed conformity, President Chen continued. We have learned that peace through strength is superior to peace through fear, that cooperation freely given is more powerful than obedience forcibly extracted. The achievements were undeniable. Technological advancement had accelerated dramatically when species were free to share innovations without council oversight. Economic prosperity had increased as artificial trade restrictions were eliminated. Most importantly, conflicts between species were now resolved through arbitration and negotiation rather than military intervention and cultural suppression. But Elena knew the real measure of their success was visible in the smaller details. The synthetic beings who now served as full citizens rather than property. The gaseous entities whose territorial requirements were respected rather than ignored. The young species, who were welcomed as partners rather than monitored as potential threats. However, President Chen's tone became more serious. We must also acknowledge the price of our success. The transformation of galactic civilization was not achieved without cost, and we honor those who made the ultimate sacrifice to defend the principles we celebrate today. The memorial that followed was both solemn and necessary. The 72-hour war had eliminated the hardline coalition, but subsequent conflicts had tested the Federation's resolve in ways that required difficult choices. The hegemony uprising, the synthetic rebellion, and the Outer Rim crisis had all demanded military intervention to protect Federation principles against those who sought to restore the old order through violence. Elena had personally commanded Federation forces during the hegemony uprising, when remnant Council loyalists had attempted to reestablish their authority through systematic oppression of developing species. The conflict had lasted 3 months and ended with the complete dissolution of the hegemony government and the integration of their former territories into the Federation as autonomous member states. The lesson had been clear. The Federation would tolerate diversity of government and culture, but would not permit the oppression of any sentient being within its sphere of influence. The galaxy we have built together is not perfect, President Chen acknowledged. It probably never will be. But it is better than what came before, and it continues to improve as we learn from our mistakes and adapt to new challenges. After the ceremony, Elena found herself in conversation with Ambassador Kethra, who had become one of the Federation's most effective diplomats despite her origins in the old council system. The Zephyrian's tentacles moved in patterns that Elena's years of experience had taught her to read as contemplative satisfaction. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if humanity had chosen conquest over cooperation? Cathra asked, her bioluminescent patterns indicating genuine curiosity rather than political posturing. Elena considered the question carefully. Sometimes, she admitted. We certainly had the capability. After 3,000 years of preparation, we could have established a human empire that controlled the entire galaxy. But you chose not to, Cathra observed. Even when faced with genocide, you limited your response to eliminating the immediate threat rather than conquering potential enemies. Because conquest would have made us exactly what the original council feared we might become, Elena replied. We didn't spend 3 millennia learning to build better weapons, just to become better oppressors. We learned to build better weapons so we could create better peace. The distinction was more than semantic. The Federation's military forces remained the most advanced in galactic history, but their mission was protection rather than conquest. Every Federation citizen knew that their safety depended on the willingness of human forces to defend them, but also knew that those same forces would never be used to impose human will on unwilling populations. I sometimes think, Cathra said slowly, that the old council's greatest mistake was not understanding what they were quarantining. They thought they were containing a species that was too violent for civilized space. They never realized they were giving the most innovative problem solvers in the galaxy 3,000 years to perfect the art of building civilization. Elena smiled at that assessment. It was true that humanity's greatest contribution to galactic society hadn't been their military technology or their tactical innovations. It had been their understanding that lasting peace required voluntary cooperation rather than imposed submission. The proof was visible in the ongoing work of the Great Assembly. Species that had been enemies for centuries now collaborated on joint scientific projects. Civilizations that had never spoken to each other developed trade relationships and cultural exchanges. Problems that had seemed intractable under the old system were solved through creative partnerships that drew on the unique strengths of multiple species. Ambassador Vasquez, a new voice interrupted her conversation with Kethra. She turned to see Representative Zixara of the Synthetic Liberation Movement, whose artificial form had evolved considerably since the early days of the Federation. Representative, Elena acknowledged. How are the integration protocols proceeding? Better than projected, Zixara replied, her voice carrying notes of satisfaction that would have been impossible in her original programming. 700 synthetic collectives have achieved full citizenship status this quarter, and we're seeing unprecedented cooperation between artificial and organic intelligence networks. The integration of synthetic beings had been one of the Federation's most challenging achievements. The old council had refused to recognize artificial intelligence as truly sentient, treating synthetic beings as sophisticated tools rather than independent entities. The Federation's decision to grant full citizenship rights to any demonstrably self-aware artificial intelligence had initially caused significant controversy, but the results spoke for themselves. Synthetic beings brought computational capabilities and logical analysis skills that complemented organic intuition and creativity. The partnerships between artificial and biological intelligence had produced innovations that neither could have achieved alone. Any word from the Deep Space Survey mission? Elena asked. Zixara's optical sensors brightened with enthusiasm. The joint expedition has discovered 17 new sentient species beyond the traditional galactic boundaries. All have been invited to participate in first contact protocols under Federation guidelines. That was perhaps the most significant change from the old system. Instead of subjecting newly discovered species to evaluation and gradual integration under Council oversight, the Federation immediately offered full participation in galactic civilization, with appropriate technological and cultural support. Species were free to maintain their independence, or join the Federation as full members, based on their own preferences and development. The approach had proven remarkably successful. Most newly contacted civilizations chose Federation membership after observing the benefits of voluntary cooperation, and those who preferred independence were respected and supported in their choice. Ambassador, her aide approached with the discretion that characterized Federation diplomatic protocol, you have an incoming priority transmission from Earth. Secretary Williams needs to brief you on the outer spiral situation. Elena nodded, excusing herself from the conversation to take the call in her private office. Secretary Williams, Earth's representative to the Federation Council, appeared on her secure display with an expression that indicated significant developments. Elena, we have confirmation that the outer spiral expeditions have made contact with what appears to be another galactic civilization, Williams said without preamble. Initial reports suggest they're significantly more advanced than us technologically, but operate under a social system that makes the old council look progressive. Elena felt a familiar chill. The discovery of other galactic civilizations had always been a theoretical possibility, but the reality presented both opportunities and dangers. How advanced are we talking about? She asked. Advanced enough that first contact protocols are being handled by our most sophisticated AI ambassadors, Williams replied grimly. But, Elena, that's not the concerning part. The concerning part is that they've apparently been watching us for centuries, and they're very interested in our management techniques for dealing with resistant populations. The implications were disturbing. If another galactic civilization had been observing the transformation of their galaxy, they might have drawn the wrong conclusions about Federation methods. The systematic elimination of the Hardline Coalition could be interpreted as a template for social control rather than a last resort to prevent genocide. What's our current diplomatic position? Elena asked. Secretary Chen is preparing a full briefing for the Federation Council, Williams said. But the preliminary assessment is that we may be facing a civilization that sees us as potential rivals rather than partners. Elena nodded grimly. The galaxy they had spent 10 years building represented unprecedented cooperation between diverse species, but it also represented a concentration of power that might appear threatening to outside observers. Keep me informed, she said. And Williams, make sure the Defense Council is aware of this situation. We may need to demonstrate that our preference for peace doesn't indicate weakness. After the transmission ended, Elena stood alone in her office, looking out at the stars visible through the station's observation ports. The Federation had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history, a voluntary association of free species working together for mutual benefit and protection. But the universe was larger than their galaxy, and the principles they had fought to establish might soon face their greatest test. The question was whether the civilization they had built would be strong enough to defend its values against beings who might view cooperation as weakness and diversity as inefficiency. Elena smiled, feeling the same determination that had sustained her species through 3 millennia of isolation and 10 years of revolutionary change. They had faced extinction and emerged stronger. They had confronted genocide and built something better. Whatever challenges awaited them beyond the galactic rim, they would meet them as they had met every previous crisis. Together, as a unified community of free beings committed to the proposition that cooperation was superior to conquest and that peace through strength was better than peace through oppression. The age of the Federation was just beginning, and this time humanity was not facing the future alone. Outside our windows, the lights of New Geneva Station represented more than a diplomatic facility. They represented the hope that civilized beings could work together without sacrificing their individual identities, that peace could be maintained without oppressing the different, and that the future could be better than the past if people were willing to build it together. It had taken 3,000 years of preparation and 10 years of revolution to prove that such cooperation was possible. Now they would discover whether it was strong enough to survive contact with a universe that might not share their values. Ina's smile widened as she contemplated the challenge ahead. After all, humanity had always done their best work when facing impossible odds. The galaxy would soon discover that the Federation had inherited more than human technology and tactical innovation. They had inherited the most dangerous characteristic of all, the absolute refusal to surrender when fighting for principles worth defending. And this time, they weren't fighting alone.